Hey everyone, I just finished a copy of Grace Saves All, The Necessity of Christian Universalism by David Artman, put out by Whitfinstock. I actually, I've known about this book for a while and have listened to David's podcast off and on for a while. But I actually got a copy of this because he reached out to me and also contacted Whitfinstock to send me a copy for review after some dialogue back and forth with him. So I just want to say thank you to David and thank you to Whitfinstock for the copy of a review. This is my honest reaction to the book. And it's possible that David and I might actually have some dialogue on this channel at some point, which could be a lot of fun. So stay tuned in case that is of interest to you. We'll talk about universalism and all things related to that, I imagine. But let's get into my thoughts on this one. I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then my reactions as a whole. Grace Saves All is an unabashed, unapologetic case for Christian Universalism, and that word in the subtitle is important, the necessity of it. I'm going to get back to that in my reactions, but I think that's an important nuance to add to what this book is trying to do. It really is trying to argue that this is a necessary conclusion that Christians should embrace, or at least be open to. And so the main idea, that's kind of the main idea then. It is a case for Christian Universalism, but it's a case that it kind of situates it does a few things. It does make a good bit of biblical arguments. It also situates the kind of current understanding of Christian Universalism in its kind of historical trajectory within evangelical expression. And it kind of engages with lots of current debates around universalism, some of the common pushbacks you'll get about things like free will, so on and so forth. So it's part biblical case, it's part kind of cultural summary, cultural analysis of how are the arguments received or pushed back on in certain circles, and then a defense of how Christian Universalism should be embraced, given all of those different push and pull factors. So that's what Grace Saves All is doing in a really pretty remarkably short, I don't know if you saw when I held it up, it's a very, very thin little book, so covering a lot of ground and not a high page count. I'll say a little bit more about the nuances of the argument when I get to the reaction, but really quickly, the research behind the book, because it is so intentionally popular level kind of pitch, it's not to be really compared to bigger academic works on the topic. But one thing I really liked about the research is he points to some sources I was not aware of as someone who's pretty well read. There's one scholar in particular that he points to that has this massive work. I feel like I should look up the name now. But it's a massive work on the doctrine of apokatastasis that I was not aware of this scholar's work. So, and then there's a long section at the end that I love when books like this do this, especially popular level books that are not trying to cover all the ground, not be comprehensive. He provides a long list of recommended readings, which is kind of an annotated look of at other books on the topic that I really love when people do this. Ilaria Ramelli, that's the scholar. The Christian Doctrine of Apokatastasis, a Critical Assessment. I think it's a woman, she has published like a 1,000-page work on that doctrine. I wasn't even aware of that book, so I'm so glad that I've discovered it through Grace Saves All. But more on the research, just really quickly. There's some biblical exegesis that's done here, but he engages more with the writings of other universalists. David Bentley Hart shows up, Robin Perry shows up as Gregory MacDonald, Thomas Talbot. So, and also he cites other popular evangelical writers, N.T. Wright, John Piper, to engage with how some of the common pushbacks look, arguments against the conclusions of Christian Universalism. So that's what all shows up in the research. The readability of it, this is super readable, almost conversational, pastoral in tone, very easy to get through in terms of its style. Anyone, reader or not, big reader or not, you could read this. I think it was designed and structured to be super engaging and not super intimidating or inscrutable at all. So chapters are short. It's organized in a very kind of clear, logical progression, works through all the topics you'd expect through very known scriptures. There's a whole chapter on just some references in Revelation that always come up. And then there's chapters that deal with free will and pushback. And then the last chapter is actually his story, which is super engaging and super readable. It's a great way to end the book. So super easy to read. No hesitations there. I would give this to basically anybody with an interest in the topic. It might be, I haven't really thought about this till literally right now, but it might be my go-to intro on the topic, potentially. Holy Hell, that I read a few months ago by Derek Kublis, is also kind of in the same vein, but this one even has a little bit more of some personal touch. So I don't know. They're both similar though in that regard. All right, my reactions to this book. So I've talked openly on this channel about where I'm at. You can see my video on my journey through the doctrine of hell in my Barely Evangelical series. I still call even after reading this book, and he pushes on this, I'll say more about that in a second. He pushes people like me. I am in that hopeful universalist camp. I have moved over years towards recognizing universalism, Christian universalism, universal reconciliation of all things, that God will be all in all. I've moved towards recognizing that as a very valid and historically represented option within Orthodox Christian history. I think it's very valid. I think that people who think it should not be at the table at all are actually wrong. I think it should be there. I think it should be represented. I think it should be wrestled with and engaged with. I am still not in the confident, some would say dogmatic, certain. I'm not in the place of saying that this is certainly correct. This is the way to talk about how all things, will be worked out ultimately. So I'm in that hopeful universalist camp. He's actually quite critical of the hopeful universalists like me in this book. That's why that word necessity of Christian universalism is in the subtitle, because he is arguing that it's a necessary conclusion to get to. And hopefully universalists resist that as a step too far. I still have specific reasons that I'm there, which maybe he and I will engage on if we do a dialogue. Nevertheless, even though he's critical of my position in this book, I liked this book quite a bit. I think it's very good for a few reasons, and I'll enumerate just a couple of those here. I think his chapters on the Bible are great. I really, really like the way he engages with the biblical texts. I think it's something that puts this book above even a few of those others I mentioned, particularly for people with a more mainstream conservative evangelical background. He doesn't avoid engaging with any of the texts that always come up, the sheep and the goats, for example, so on and so forth. I have one or two very minor quibbles of things I wish he would have fleshed out a little bit more in some of the ways he engages with that. The parable with Lazarus as well is in there. But I think he does a really good job. He does a very good job getting into the linguistics, the language of it, the cultural background of Gehenna, the cultural, the meaning of the Greek term aionios. He does a great job with all that stuff. It's very clear. It's very fair. I think it's very careful. And it's also not overwrought, not overlong. There's a really interesting chapter on Irenaeus and what all went down on the Fifth Ecumenical Council. That subject feels to me like a hornet's nest that I have not really begun to wrap my mind around. Universalists across that spectrum are very frustrated with the popular kind of memory of the Fifth Ecumenical Council and what happened there. People who don't like Universalists always talk about the Fifth Ecumenical Council as though it's just this done deal that the church settled. The doctrine of apokatastasis is off the board. That just feels to me like there's a lot of layers of complexity of historical interpretation and even just how things were recorded. So he gets into that here, and some really helpful things. He brings up some very helpful research and some very clear explanations, but it still feels to me like that's a massive hornet's nest, like I said, that I can't claim to really have any confident interpretations of. But I'm glad it's in this book. I really think that's an important thing to wrestle with, is what happened at that council. A couple other things I do want to talk about to round out this review that I really like about this book. He's hard on Calvinists, which is not surprising, but what surprised me is that he is critical of Arminian theology, and he's critical of, like I said, hopefully universalism. And I want to comment a little bit on that before I end this review. I really, really like he brings this kind of a heuristic or kind of a tool of analysis to this book that's very simple. It's reminiscent of some of the ways that people talk about the problem of evil being, if God is all loving and all powerful, then why do bad things happen? He kind of brings a tool like that to the problem of hell, and he talks about, but he frames it through grace. So he talks about if grace alone saves, and grace goes to all, then why is it that not all are saved? And the ways that both Calvinists and Arminians square that, he finds deeply unsatisfactory. And if anything, I feel like he's a little bit more sharply critical of the ways that Arminians square it, which is to say, kind of the accusation of synergism, which is to say that, well, grace goes to all and grace alone saves, but then like some people resist it, or it gives too much on people to kind of gives too much agency or too much control on people to remove themselves from the possibility of salvation, which then implies that actually grace is not really what's saving in that case. Some would argue that he's maybe being too simplistic in his ways he's, mapping those things out, but I think he does a really good job, and I really like that way of framing it in a popular level book to kind of get in thinking at a deeper level about some of these issues. So I really like that, and I was surprised, but also I found it helpful how critical he was of the way that kind of the open Arminian construal of that issue is. I also really appreciated the way he wrestled with the free will pushback. Now, for me, David Bentley Hart kind of resolved that issue in my mind. I no longer think about that as a legitimate pushback to truly thoughtfully rendered Christian Universalism. The idea that God preserves our free will even to the extent of us choosing away from him forever. I actually don't find that convincing anymore because of some David Bentley Hart's work on that. But I think if you're not interested in David Bentley Hart's writing, or for whatever reason you're not going to read That All May Be Saved, I think David Artman does a great job in this book of bringing the same concerns to the table about the implications of actually really believing that God would preserve our free will, which presumably the only reason you choose away from God is because your freedom is being inhibited by sin and by misunderstanding of who God is and the actual goodness and love and grace of God. Like, your ability to choose away from that is you're only really able to choose away from that because of sin clouding your understanding, and the idea that God would preserve that into eternity so you can eternally choose away from him does start to get philosophically and theologically super concerning. And I think he does a great job in this book at wrestling with that argument too. So yeah, that's me. I'm kind of roaming around through some of the things that he does in this book, but again, this is a very short package. It's very popularly written, and he does cover quite a bit of ground in it, in a very thoughtful way. And I'll end this by saying, while it did not decisively knock me over the move the needle for me, so to speak, into this convinced, certain, necessary universalist way of thinking, he's really there's some things in here that challenged me. And actually, to be honest, the afterword by Thomas Talbot, who wrote a few pages at the end, that afterword actually really pushed on some of my things that are holdouts for me philosophically in terms of why I'm a hopeful universalist. And the afterword actually was quite challenging, honestly. So I would recommend, if you're like me, that short couple pages by Talbot really was something. But this book as a whole, very good, very helpful, very thoughtful, pretty comprehensive, frames the argument in some helpful ways that I don't see other books framing it. And is worth a read if you're wrestling through this topic. It's a live kind of thing for you, like it is for me. This is a really, really helpful book, and I think it's coming also from a perspective of someone who knows very much what it's like to be inside the kind of traditional conservative, what for a long time in American evangelicalism was the standard account of eternal conscious torment of hell. He knows what that is, knows what that's like, and speaks to it very thoughtfully and pastorally. So those are my thoughts on Wittgenstock's publication, Grace Saves All, by David Artman. Hopefully this gave me something to think about, or maybe points you towards a book you'll spend some time with. But as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.